Oh, Sid.
All right, welcome everybody to our May installment of our RSVP digital events. On behalf of the RSVP Digital Event Committee, I am Kari Newman from the University of Delaware. And I see many of our committee members here. If you want to give a quick wave, we are headed by our own VP Preeti Joshi from the University of Washington. So this promises to be a wonderful event. Yeah, and so without further ado, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. So this is a Pick-A-Periodical event in which we are having asked Patrick Leary to share with us a very interesting periodical, and hopefully you had a chance to go look at some of the open access issues before this, but if you haven't, that's totally fine. I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful discussion. So the way this works is Patrick will give us sort of a brief introduction. He's got some slides to share about the journal. And then we will open it up for discussion and we'll see where the conversation takes us. So without further ado, I think I'll introduce Patrick, a man who almost needs no introduction, but I asked him for one anyway. So Patrick Leary is a former president of RSVP and the author of The Punch Brotherhood, Table Talk and Print Culture in Mid-Victorian London. He has written widely on authorship, the 19th century press, and the digital turn in Victorian research. Patrick also founded and still manages the Victoria listserv/discussion group, which I'm sure if you haven't joined, you definitely should. It's a wonderful place to have conversation, get tips, and that kind of thing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick.
Well, thanks, Kari, and thanks for all your help getting this set up. Thank you to RSVP. I see a lot of members of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals here, but if you're not a member, you should absolutely join. I mean, this is really a very collegial, warm group of people. It's been a real home for me, and the journal is great too. So all you got to do is subscribe to the Victorian Periodicals Review, makes you a member. You get a newsletter. You meet a lot of interesting people. It's very cheap. So I highly recommend joining RSVP and subscribing to the journal. As Kari said, if you haven't already, feel free to run over. She's got a link to the Hathi Trust volumes of press news and that she'll put in the chat, 1878, 79, and 80. I'm not gonna read to you, but I have made some notes here about things I wanted to mention about the journal, and then that's sort of the background and history of it. But while I'm bloviating, feel free to just go over and start browsing around. Just browse anywhere in these volumes. There are a lot of ads to flip through, although, as I will note, they have an interest of their own. And go through the letterpress, and I'm pretty sure you'll see at least one or two things that you find intriguing, as I did. So let me start by talking a little bit about how I first came to know this journal. Kari mentioned this book on Punch while I was working on that, and I was looking at a dissertation from the 70s by Selina Fox about graphic journalism in the 1830s and 40s. And she had a little thing about Punch, and there was a footnote, and the footnote referenced an anonymous article in this journal I had never heard of, the London Provincial and Colonial Press News. And it was by a printer who had worked at Bradbury and Evans, the publishers of Punch, while they were first bringing it out. And it had little anecdotes about the people who contributed to Punch. I thought, well, this is interesting. So the next chance I got, I mean, it was very hard to find this journal. You couldn't find it in the United States. The first chance I got, I made a little pilgrimage in London to the St. Bride Printing Library, which has a complete run of the journal. And if you've never been to St. Bride's, it's a great library. It's a great little library. It's down by Blackfriars Bridge. Fantastic collection of material, printed and otherwise, about the printing trades. It is currently open one afternoon a week. So if you plan to go, plan carefully. So I went and I looked this article up, and it turned out not to be anonymous at all. It was underneath the title, it said by our editor. and it turned out to be by the editor and founder of the journal that it had appeared in. So I got what I needed for the Punch book, but I was really intrigued by the journal and intrigued by the story of its editor and founding. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about this and basically kind of make a case for why I think it's worth talking about this journal. It is, of course, an obscure journal. Very few of you will have heard of it before, I would imagine. It's a trade journal, and trade journals are traditionally been neglected by scholarship, although that is changing. And let me recommend this new book from Andrew King, who has been at the forefront of making that change and bringing more attention to the trade and professional press. It's called Work and the 19th Century Press, just came out in the last few months, and it's actually in an affordable paperback. So I believe Kari has a link to that as well. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about William Dorrington, because he's really going to be kind of my focus today in talking about press news. He starts his apprenticeship as a printer when he's 13 years old. And after he finishes his 7 years and he's a journeyman, at some point eventually he gets hired on to Bradbury and Evans, right after Bradbury and Evans has printed Pickwick. So they are Dickens's printers. He gets to, and they are, while he's there, they start publishing Punch. Well, so he gets to know all the Punch crew, Douglas Jerrold, who had himself been a compositor. And Dorrington is joining a group of over 200 compositors that work there at Bradbury and Evans. And in fact, among the many jobs he's doing all sorts of odd jobs there. And he helps typeset Nicholas Nickleby, which is the next thing they're printing. He gets to know Douglas Jerrold, who had been a compositor, and he becomes very close friends with Henry Mayhew. And he will remain close friends with Mayhew for the rest of Mayhew's life, and has some interesting things to say about him in the journal. At the same time that he's learning all these different jobs at this very professionally run printing business. I mean, Bradbury and Evans are renowned in the trade for being really well run and doing really good work. So he's held to rather very high standards there, and he's learning all these different jobs there. At the same time, he is venturing out on his own as an author. He's writing sketches and tales for the Police Gazette and the Penny Satirist. He's publishing poems in the London Press. He's writing Christmas pantomimes for London theaters. He's doing penny dreadfuls for Holywell Street publishers. He's doing all of this creative activity. And if you want, and he's not alone in that kind of thing among compositors. If you want to learn more about this, David Finkelstein published a book a couple of years back called Movable Types. And it's all about roving creative printers. And he's got a whole chapter in there about that. And there's the link in the chat. And Dorrington makes a cameo appearance in the book. It's a very, very good book. So he has a really long, he's there for a number of years. And I would argue that besides what he's learning about printing and the press, while he's at Bradbury and Evans, it is a formative experience in a larger sense, because Bradbury and Evans at this time is going through this transition where they start off as a printing firm, and that's all they do. They do jobbing printing. They print for a lot of people, to becoming publishers, and not just any publishers, but one of the most prominent publishers in England. I mean, they're publishing Dickens, who decides to skip the middleman, Chapman and Hall, and just have his printers become his publishers. They also publish Thackeray, and of course they publish Punch, which is wildly successful. This attracts other authors to them, and Dorrington meets a number of these other authors. He has funny anecdotes about people like Harrison Ainsworth, and how bad their handwriting is, and all this kind of thing. But I think that this experience of Bradbury and Evans, seeing Bradbury and Evans make this transition, which culminates in a way in 1846 when they bring out a rival to the Times of London, the Daily News newspaper, which is mainly funded by Bradbury and Evans. I think it enlarges his sense of the possibilities of how people working in a print shop can then become players in the larger world of the press. And so he starts Press News. He publishes the first one in January 1866. Now, hold on a second. I want to, as long as I'm talking about Dorrington, I should show you a picture of Dorrington. Let's see here. Here we go. There he is. There he is. Looking, beefy and somewhat self-satisfied, as befits a Victorian self-made man. He's 50 years old when he starts this journal. And as I've said, he's had all these experiences. He's been active in these printers organizations. He's on the council of the London Society of Compositors. He's involved with various charities. And by this time, many of the compositors he knew and served his apprenticeship and journeyman periods with had also worked their way up, and they were editors and proprietors of various newspapers, or they had started their own printing businesses. He himself became editor of a more conventional trade magazine, the Printer's Register, for 2-3 years before he starts Press News. Now, I just want to pause for a moment and mention that the timing of this start, he's working on it all through 1865, and he starts in 1866, is significant because of what's happening in the press. The press is entering a period of real volatility and change in the 1860s, the latter part of the 1860s. You'll recall that the last of the taxes on knowledge, the paper duty, is repealed in 1861. And the stamp tax and the advertising duty had been repealed before that. And the changes wrought by the lifting of these burdens are percolating, not immediately, but they are definitely percolating through the press. There is a race to lower cover prices. Everybody's racing to the penny cover price. Some journals go under, like the Morning Chronicle goes under. Some are struggling. Others are being launched, and some of these are like they've been going along at 4p cover price and selling 5,000 copies a week, and now suddenly they're selling 50,000 copies a week at a penny cover price. So there's a lot going on here. The whole scale of the newspaper and periodical business is changing, and there are, of course, technological changes. I don't need to enumerate them, but these new faster presses are coming in to serve these much larger circulations. I mean, Lloyd's Weekly is selling 500,000 copies a week. There's a lot going on. And in 1865, when Dorrington's getting ready to publish, the Echo comes out at a halfpenny. So here's and they are apparently doing well, and they do in fact very well. What I think of as the definitive guide to all of this post-repeal stuff is a wonderful book by Martin Hewitt called The Dawn of the Cheap Press. And Kari has a link to that one too. It was a runner-up for the Colby Prize a few years back, and it really goes into detail. And as Andrew knows, a lot of these changes are particularly pronounced in the Provincial press. So Dorrington is excited about these changes. He sees this as modernity. He sees this cheap press as a progressive thing, as something positive, as a civilizing influence and society. He's excited to be part of it. At the same time, and this is a theme that runs through the journal, he's saying everybody who's in the press now has to adapt to these new changes. No matter what role you're playing, it's going to change. And you're going to have to be ready to adapt if you're going to survive and thrive in this new environment. So he's very much sees his journal as on the cutting edge of documenting these kinds of changes. And he has a whole long series about the penny press, the illustrated press, and so on. He himself is having to adapt. It is no easy matter starting this journal In fact, he is working a side gig as a sub-editor for a weekly in order to pay his rent and his food and his family's expenses, because he doesn't dare take a penny out of what the press news is earning, because he needs all of that to cover the cost of the journal. It is basically, this journal, like a lot of journals of its size and type, is basically a one-man band. You know, he's doing all the reporting. He's going out to all his friends and acquaintances in the printing business, and he's gathering news about, you know, traditional literary news, like Mr. Trollope has a new novel coming out in such and such a periodical, but also things about new machines that are available, new periodicals that have come out, all kinds of things. He's gathering news, and at the same time, he's gathering advertisers for his journal. So he basically writes the whole journal himself for years and years. Is very interesting. And part of what I find intriguing about the journal is this combination of the sort of literary aspect of the press and the commercial aspects of it. He is, to use Benedict Anderson's term, he has an imagined community of the press that's very expansive and inclusive. And you really see that on this masthead. I love this masthead. First of all, we use this for the publicity for this, so you may have seen this already. But so you've got these three spheres of activity underneath, where it's, you've got the compositors here on the left, you got what we would call proofreaders and copy editors in the middle. One of them might be a sub-editor, hard to tell. And then you've got the people running the printing machine at the right. And you'll notice this duality. It is a literary and business journal. And it's these two wings that make it so innovative. Similarly, conducted by Mr. William Dorrington, editor, or printer rather, and journalist. So he's very much foregrounding this duality of roles of himself and his journal. Now, I was puzzled when I was going through the later issues of the journal that the masthead seemed to disappear. And I thought, uh-oh, are they changing direction? What's going on? No, that's not what happened. Although that is what, whoever wrote the entry in the DNCJ on Dorrington that got so many things wrong, I'm sorry to say. Well, one of them was that they concluded that they were no longer interested in this expansive view because this masthead disappeared, but that's not true. What happened was it moved to the cover. And I only know this because I'm going along, look at St. Bride's, and I'm looking at these volumes, and suddenly I come across a volume that has the covers bound in. Now, those of you here who work on periodicals know that, generally speaking, bound volumes of Victorian periodicals have no covers in them. They're all stripped out before the volumes are bound, or they're never printed in the first place for the bound versions. So it was really cool to see this cover that has, you know, it's stiff paper. It's got this sort of bluish green. And it has a monthly literary business journal. By 1880s, it has gone up from 1 penny to 2pence. But they've also added this cool subtitle here for printers, newspaper proprietors, editors, booksellers, publishers, bookbinders, stationers, and every trade connected with the production of a book. And a production of a book in the most expansive kind of book history sense. You know, everything in the press, that's what they're all about. And in fact, that's what you find inside them. So I'm just going to conclude here by talking briefly about three things that I think, and there's more than this, but three things that I think are particularly interesting that deserve our greater scrutiny, scholarly scrutiny, that are about this little journal. And one of them is this. Now, I circulated copies of this, the Press Character series that runs in '69. It is so characteristically Dorrington, and it contains themes that run throughout his tenure as editor, and he's basically editor up until he dies in 1894. So these sketches are by an illustrator named Robert Prouse. Proust did a lot of illustrating for a number of important penny dreadfuls. And I suspect that Dorrington met him when Dorrington himself was writing penny dreadfuls back in the 1840s. Anyway, he, from time to time, contributes mostly comic kind of sketches to the journal. Now, there's a link to this. If you haven't had a chance to look at any of these, you can download these, and you can download the full description for each of these 12 things that came out every month for 12 months. But just to look at one of them for a minute, the sub-editor, there's a lot of interest in sub-editors. Kitty Ledbetter has written about sub-editors. Stephen Pigeon has written about them, and for good reason. I mean, they're obviously a clear, an important part of the press. There's a lot of the things I like about the discussion of Dorrington's discussion of the sub-editors. He makes a distinction between, for example, sub-editors who work for daily press and sub-editors who work for the weekly press. So they're both called sub-editors, but in fact, they're doing very different things. He also makes a distinction, and this is true of some of the other sketches of press characters, between people who are doing this job badly and people who are doing it well. To him, the scissors and paste man is the worst possible sub-editor. He's not using his brain to distill things in a graceful way. Anyway, it's very interesting. And finally, he sees, and this is characteristic again, he sees sub-editing as a way station for people who are working their way up through some of these other jobs in the press room towards becoming an editor and perhaps even a proprietor, basically retracing the arc of William Dorrington's own career. Although it is worth remembering that while he was writing this, he himself had this side job as a sub-editor. All right, the second thing I was going to mention was the advertising. Dorrington is very interesting and astute about the costs of putting out a newspaper in particular, and about how important the advertising is, because that cover price is not going to cover very much of your costs. You need a robust foundation of advertising. And you see this in the journal itself. If you look at those volumes in HathiTrust, there's a ton of advertising, so much that they start having to have an index, a name by name of advertisers, and a subject index. So if you're looking for ink, you can go find all the ones who are selling ink. I think this becomes one of the great selling points of the journal as it matures. And so there's that. But also, I think the individual advertisements can be of interest to scholars. Here's one that I found really interesting. This is basically an image library. So Cassell and Company have 70,000 engravings for sale, from wood engravings that they're making electrotypes of. So, and I found this very intriguing. They have a list, which I would love to see this list, where everything is organized by subject. Wouldn't it be interesting to see how they tagged all of these engravings? So you say, well, I need something with a dog and a boat. What have you got? So you wind up with this, and they are far from the only firm in this business at a time when all of us, I think, are more and more interested in the way images circulated in the 19th century internationally in the illustrated press. These kind of firms are a very key part of that process. And I think you learn a lot just by looking at the advertisements. And here's another one, almost at random, the rotary printing machine from Whitefriars. And what I found intriguing about this is this part that I've highlighted on the right. They tell you what periodicals are being printed on this press. And if you're like me, you're not going to recognize a lot of these. I mean, it's going to send us scurrying to the Waterloo Directory to see, young men of Great Britain, but I find it very interesting. This is a smaller press. It's not one of the big presses. It does 5,000 copies an hour, but there's still plenty of people using these presses for various purposes, including Bradbury and Evans, which has much bigger and more powerful presses. Anyway, I found it interesting that invoking the names of these periodicals was part of the sales pitch for this printing machine. And finally, I just want to mention the role of reminiscence. Now, press news, because, as embodied in its title, is all about what's new in the press. So it's all about new techniques, new machines, new periodicals being founded, all this kind of thing. But there is a steady stream of reminiscence throughout the journal about older ways of doing things and about people and events that Dorrington witnessed in the course of his career. And this all culminates 20 years on in 1886, when he begins very modestly this memoir, Incidents of My Life. Okay. And as you can see, he's starting off talking about his father, who cut type out of wood for posters. It's a fascinating thing. And he gets apprenticed to a printing business. Here it is blown up. He winds up writing and publishing 36 installments of the Incidents of My Life. So he starts it here in 86. He doesn't conclude it until 1889. Maybe David or somebody can correct me on this, but I suspect that this is the most extensive memoir of any Victorian printer. And I hope sometime we can publish this somehow with an introduction, because it is full of fascinating pen portraits of all kinds of people that he knew in the trade. Some of them are familiar names, and some of them you've never heard of, but it's a really interesting account of, as he says, his 60 years experience as a printer and a journalist. He dies just 5 years after he concludes this. This appeared with his obituary, which mentioned that he had contributed to every issue of Press News up until 1 month before he died at the age of 78. And his children, his children continued the paper, his two sons, until 1912. So that basically is my case for why we should be paying more attention to journals like this, and to this journal in particular. And I want to thank you for your attention. And I'm eager to hear, what y'all think about all this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, everybody, if you want to give a quick round of applause, that was so fascinating.
Oh, thanks.
And wonderful. So I will open up the floor. Anybody, if you'd like to either come off camera or chat, I'll be monitoring chat and trying to keep an eye on the room to see who's got their hand up. You can use the little raise hand feature either. Probably best to do it via the Zoom feature, since I can only see so many of you on the screen at once. If anybody on the Digital Events Committee would like to help me just kind of make sure that, but we'll just open up the conversation for questions, for things that you might have found. And once again, I'm going to put all the links that Patrick referenced in the chat. And I see a hand up from David.
Well, Patrick, you probably would have expected me to come in. It's fantastic to hear you talking about William Dorrington, who, as you know, is someone I've been particularly interested in, and particularly following your lead and finding out about him. I mean, the ironies about that memoir I just mentioned that you mentioned, I was trying to track it down in the British Library. It does not exist there anymore. So unless the St. Brides have maintained their copy, you are the possessor, or perhaps the only extant version known to humanity currently in the world. So congratulations. Oh, no, the one thing I wanted to mention was, and I'm sure you've done this already, but what's really interesting about to me about what you're talking about is also the way in which Dorrington was using the magazine to speak to a specific cohort. And in doing so, he would often use, I'm sure you know that's something you've mentioned, a particular language that would be specific to those who were in the know. So trade press lingo or slang. And I found what was interesting when I was reading through it, and I'm sure it's something you picked up as well, was that you'd find that he would be speaking in a way that required inside knowledge, or knowledge that, from a London centered, or even I know you're talking about because you're speaking in code about a certain activity that's going on about someone who's perhaps lost their job or, their press has gone under, but we will not mention who it is, but we will mention it in a roundabout way to enable you, those who are in the know, to know exactly who I'm talking about. I wonder if you could expand a bit more on what you saw about that kind of fit that particular example.
That is absolutely true. And it's been so much fun working on this. I don't think I mentioned that I'm actually writing an article about this finally after 20 years of looking at this journal. Yeah, you're right. In fact, I need a glossary of printers terms because, he'll say, well, when I was working at Coins on, on the such and such platen, I was, and I, wait, what you were doing what? It's very, you're right. He's speaking to people who know all those terms because they have been there, because they are printers. And I think you're right that is the kind of default setting for his audience in a lot of what he's writing. When he's addressing a wider audience, he often makes it explicit. Like in the very first couple of issues, he has some articles about what authors owe to printers. And it is clearly aimed at authors, and his constant refrain is, now listen, authors, you've got to write more clearly and you've got to stop waiting until the last minute to turn in your stuff. Basically, he's on about this all the time, about the way compositors in particular are abused by authors by their arrogance, thinking, well, I'm the creative one. I can wait until the last minute, Harrison Ainsworth was notorious for this, but at least he would show up at the print shop and walk around smoking a big cigar with a glass of brandy and just sort of talk out what his changes to his proofs should be. There's all kinds of wonderful stories in there. But you're absolutely right. There is very much a kind of, you and I know what this kind of person is in a print shop. That press characters, he's assuming that most of his readers have encountered all these people, and they've encountered bad versions of some of these people. And so there's a kind of a culture of complaint also involved, where there's what it's like when you've got somebody, a sub-editor who's, has no get up and go and is just using the paste pot, So no, that's a really interesting thing. I don't know about, I really think we need to get the incidents of my life out there. So I'm working on that.
This is an example I mentioned of the only other one I know about that. I don't know if you could see that. On the Road, Journeys of a Tramping Printer. This came out in 1899, 1904. It's about this printer who basically went on a tramping circuit, but speaks a lot about both the trade, but also the way it works and his experiences moving from town to town, seeking jobs. It's the only one I know of that's like this, extensive enough that it covered 5 years worth of contributions to the typographical circular. But you were right. I think Dorrington got there first, but also is probably a bit more interesting. Well, not mentioned, but has that kind of thing that makes you and me get very excited. Much more about anything else.
And it's been buried in the journal all these years. It doesn't get published. Basically, it's just been buried. So it's an important thing, I think, to try and unearth. Just like that press character series has just been sitting there since 1869. I mean, there's no reference to it anywhere that I can find. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Patrick.
And I see Kathy's hand up. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, Patrick. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. It's the title's got London, Provincial, and Colonial in it. What I know nothing about the journal. What form does the Colonial take, either by way of contributions or evidence of a readership that he's trying to reach?
Good question. It frequently takes the form of invited essays that have been contributed from Australian printers. So he'll have a little segment on, and oftentimes he'll have a whole section on Colonial, and it'll be mostly Australian. print shops. Well, here, this new machine has been making great, been widely adopted here, or this or that. The Melbourne Punch is doing this or that, or other new periodicals. It's really quite interesting. And he has, even though it's not Colonial, he does have a fair amount of American news, which is interesting. If there's some new illustrated paper out of New York, he'll often find room to mention that as well.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, I think I saw Preeti and then Andrew.
Thanks, Kari. Thank you, Patrick. That was just amazing. And in terms of Kathy's question about Colonial, so with the 3 volumes, I just sort of did word searches, because that's what happens. You can do them when you've got the nice PDF. And it was really striking to me that so I did India, and of course, bad word to search in the print trade, because what you get is lots of sort of equipment that is India ink, India roller. So, very little actually that I found that was in the letterpress section about India, aside from in the ads. And then the other word search I did was Africa, quite a bit about South Africa. And here's what I noticed is in the letterpress, and a lot of that was what I would call very conservative items. And it had something to do with what you had mentioned earlier about Dorrington's sort of vision of the press as a civilizing instrument. So a lot of it was, when these people learn how to read properly, then they will get civilized. And so I just thought that was a really interesting thing, and it reads, even for these were 1878, 79, 80, really conservative. But my question for you is, as I thought about the focus and your conversation with David in particular, is what I'm going to call sort of the macro and the micro, right? On the one hand, you have this sort of sense of press characters, these composite figures, and it's a type. And then on the other hand, you have, as you described it, a lot of gossip, if you will, or just information about particular people. And in some senses, that sort of push and pull between the individual human and the composite type is, of course, the novel as a form is all about, right? It's Elizabeth Bennet, but it's really a young woman who, and Kathy Gallagher has written wonderfully about it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, not only what the journal is doing, but how for us as people who are thinking about giving attention to these forms, these newspapers and journals, how we can, as scholars, manage that. Because I found it really difficult. I mean, people today talk about me as the John Lang person, and I'm like, I'm not writing about John Lang. I'm writing about a newspaper that he edited, but we talk about the individuals and the editor. So I just wondered if you could help us think a little bit, or if you found that push and pull is something how you've managed it.
Well, I do, if I understand your question correctly. You're right. There is a push and pull between the specific and the context, in the various contexts, professional and commercial and social and so on, in which these things are happening. And there is an innate conservatism to the journal. You're absolutely right, and it is part and parcel of this Smilesian notion of self-help. The cheap press is going to enable self-help among its readers, and the production of the cheap press is going to enable self-help among the people who produce the cheap press. They're going to, if they are sober and industrious, they are going to move up the ranks, and they are going to become creators and not just material builders of things for the press. So yeah, there is that. He does alternate a lot between this individual news that he's gathering, of individual people and these press characters, and sort of disquisitions about, he'll have a series about the illustrated press and what he thinks about the different aspects of the press, and their influence for good and evil, and and who's doing it well and who's not doing it well. He'll have reviews of different journals, and he constantly recurs to the penny press as the great phenomenon of our time, that is doing all of this civilizing work. So as scholars, we have to wade through this ideological screen, and we also have to be aware that there are comic tropes, long-standing comic tropes that are coming into play that you see in Prowse's illustrations, but that also creep into the letterpress as well.
Great, go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks, Carrie. And thanks for a fascinating talk, Patrick. It's a treasure, this, isn't it? I just wondered, were there things that Dorrington loved and things that he hated, or were there controversies between him and the readers, or between the readers? What really got his goat, apart from late copying? What else did he like?
Well, that's interesting. I think he was in a perpetual state of indignation about the poor work that people were doing in the press and getting away with it. He was also in a perpetual state of indignation about the easy time that authors and proprietors and editors had of it, as distinct from the people who were sweating in these dingy, ill-lit, stuffy rooms, doing compositor work and all that sort of thing. He's just very aware of this, and he is adamant that people are needing to cut costs, but they're trying to cut costs by nickel and diming the people who are doing all the hard work in the press room, instead of coming down with these, in what he considers these inflated salaries for literary men who are only doing a few hours work a week, but they're getting $500 a year for it, so he is very much, he's very much against, he's very much against the, Charles Dickens as editor of the Daily News kind of model, or for that matter, I think it's interesting that however, that he uses the language on his title page, the journal is conducted by William Dorrington, which is famously what Dickens uses, right, for household words. And so I don't know. I'd be interested to know. It never occurred to me to wonder how many other people are using this conducted by language. And does Dickens start that? Does he start that as a way of referring to an editor, and then everybody copies Dickens, or what? I think that's interesting. But yeah, those are the things that really get his goat. He feels that he's trying to uphold higher standards in the trade. He also publishes a little book of composing room lectures, which are basically harangues of young compositors about how not to fall by the wayside and do lousy work, how to rise in their profession. And not only are they smiles in, he actually invokes Smiles and self-help as something they all need to read if they haven't done it already. No, really, good question. There's a lot of that. I can't think of any actual controversies that make their way into the journal where he's like, having a letters to the editor back and forth with anybody. But, I haven't seen every page, so, this could turn up. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, I saw Matt, then Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. So Patrick, I think my question is basically how, kind of following on what you were saying, how this journal conceives of the literary specifically, and I think you're getting to that a bit in what you're saying about the kind of push and pull between the the lazy bohemian authors, and which feels very relatable to me, and the the hardworking compositors. But I also wonder about the so kind of the work in terms of different parts of the the print circuit, I guess, in terms of how it conceives of the literary, but also coming back to the kind of international aspect of the cheap press, not only changing scale but also changing kind of diffusion internationally and throughout the empire, and how its ideas about what the literary means might relate to that.
Yeah, interestingly, I don't see a lot of, the empire doesn't seem to figure much in his thinking, at least as far as his editorializing is concerned. What he's mostly concerned about the civilizing influence of the cheap press is the domestic working class. He's talking about the workman who can now afford to read Eliza Cook's poetry, who couldn't have afforded to read it in the Weekly Dispatch when it was at 6pence a copy. So that is his constant thing. And it's interesting you should mention the Bohemians, and I should add in answer to Andrew's question, he hates those Bohemians. Oh my goodness, he has a couple of real screeds against them. Interestingly, though, he is a fan of Sala and Yeats. At least one of those two is an ex-Bohemian, so he excuses them. But the Bohemians in general, he's got no time for, because they are, of course, improvident and not sober.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, I am wondering if you could, I don't think you mentioned it, I'm wondering if you could speak to, or if you know of the circulation of this periodical. Particularly, I'm thinking about the conversation we're kind of having about this being like provincial, but also, focused on very local news in the printing industry, but also having an interest in what's happening in Australia, but then you say not so much elsewhere, colonially. So I'm thinking about printing trade journals as something that kind of facilitates this connection of a transnational network of printers, kind of, I guess, hive mind thinking sometimes. And so how this kind of fits into that network, where it's been, does it stay local? Does it go to the colonies? Does it not?
I'm so glad you asked. He boasts that it is available in all the colonies. He boasts of this in the paper, but you don't see a huge amount of evidence of that. You do see these reports, particularly from Australia, but where it fits into this network of like typographical journals and so on that circulate internationally, that Sydney Shep, who is here today, I believe, has written about so interestingly. I really don't know, because she knows all about that and I don't. But your question about circulation is very good one, and I should have mentioned it. Well, I can't believe I didn't mention it. They're looking at this, and of course we rely on what the magazine tells us, like we commonly do for circulations, right? So there's a grain of salt there. In the 60s, they have broken 4,000. They're up to 4,250, 4,500 copies a month. A modest circulation by any measure. By the 80s, late 70s and 80s, they're down to 3,000. They seem to stabilize at 3,000 circulation, which is one reason, in fact, probably the main reason, why you see this huge expansion of advertising in the journal, because the circulation is not covering the cost. And it is worth remembering, as Dorrington points out, that penny, or even the tuppence on the cover, is not, they're not actually getting that money for the journal. They're selling to retailers and wholesalers. They're getting farthings on the penny for that. So the advertising really is crucial to covering this. It's really shocking what kind of debt some of these journals pile up when they don't have enough to cover the cost, and their circulations are soaring, but they're losing money on every copy. I mean, the Morning Chronicle, according to one source, was losing £12,000 a year. The Daily News lost well over £100,000 in its first years of operation before they figured out how to balance the cover price and the advertising revenue and the cost. So I find all that really really interesting, and you can kind of follow it in this small scale with this particular journal.
Right, and I see a question from Sydney.
Hey, Sydney.
Kia ora. You may not be able to see me because my bandwidth isn't fabulous, and I hope the sound is coming through.
It is.
But thank you, Patrick, for the shout out. And just continuing this thread of who's actually reading this particular periodical. I was interested in looking at the bookplate for the 3 volumes, and it was the San Francisco Microscopical Society. So rather than printing a printing journal speaking to printers in the book trade writ large, I was really interested that it diffused itself out into potentially related groups, but this particular one seemed a bit of an anomaly. Founded in 1870, obviously in San Francisco, which was a real hub of printing on the West Coast. And I suspect that given the issues you shared with us, that there is one anecdote in that, which I think speaks to potential interest from this collective. And it was talking about one of the curiosities of the Paris Exposition is the smallest book that was ever printed in any language, a marvel of typography. It is a microscopic copy of Dante's Divina Commedia, printed in Padua, bound in red velvet and silver, and so small that it may be worn as a charm hanging from the watch chain. A microscope is needed to read it. So quite apart from, shared interest in anything industrial, I think there's an amazing insight into other readers' communities that is really worth exploring. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you all, and we'll catch up again in due course. Kia ora.
Thank you, Sydney. Yeah, I'm writing this little article about this journal, but there's a lot more to say about it, and I hope other people will jump in and do some work on the international circulation and lots of other things about the journal. I mean, there's going to be plenty more than what I have to say about it. And I hope that all of you will help me lobby for digitization of the remaining volumes of this set. The British Library has a set, and of course St. Bride's has it. So I don't know if Beth Gaskell's here, but wouldn't it be nice to have this as part of the British Newspaper Archive?
Yes, and thank you. I definitely echo that. And I want to put in a plug for Victoria Research Web's open access periodicals that Patrick has selflessly put together for that, which is where you can find a link to the ones that we can access on HathiTrust as well. But there's a whole list of things that you can find open access. We are coming up on the hour, so I don't want to keep anybody. If you have things to go, we will probably keep it open a little bit if anyone wants to continue chatting with Patrick, but I want to make sure that we get word in edgewise for our next upcoming event in June. So I'm going to turn it over to Preeti to let her speak to that, and Matt.
Oh, well, I'm just actually going to just bop the ball over to Matt because Matt is organizing and leading up our next event. So over to you, Matt.
All right, ball caught. So next month we are going to be doing I guess a slightly more conventional format in that we're going to be doing a reading group. So for the reading, I wanted to pick something that was both kind of felt like a classic, but also something that maybe not everyone has read or hasn't read in a while. And so we're going to be reading a few chapters from Richard Altick's The Shows of London and Patrick. That's Patrick approved. Everyone, I want to note that the man of the hour. So we're going to read three chapters from it, the introduction, as well as the chapter on panoramas, topics of the times, and then the noble savage reconsidered as well, to kind of get it the book gets it so much that's lively and topical and kind of multimedia between show culture and periodical culture, that I think hopefully the idea being to reconnect with a classic, but also to think about kind of the ways that it points forward for periodical studies. So that will be on Friday, June the 9th, at our usual time, 8 Pacific Standard, 11 Eastern, and I think 4 in the British Isles. So yeah, watch for an announcement and Zoom link coming to an inbox near you soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I think before everybody jumps off, we can give a quick round of applause for Patrick once again for leading us. Like I said, if anyone would like to stick around, ask a question, continue chatting, we will keep it open for a bit more over here, but we do want to be respectful of your time. So thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Patrick.
Thanks for coming. Thanks
That
for
was-
making time for this.
Thank you.
I'll hang around. I'll close down the bar.
Patrick, can I?
As long as you're buying.
A
So
little
can
early,
I-
but why not?
Yeah,
Can I ask you about the illustrations? So, I mean, he doesn't include that as a press character. You said there's a whole series on it. I want to get my hands on that. If you can direct me, or if you, yeah.
that was such a good point to make. And there is a series about the illustrated press, but it's not so much about the illustrators. In fact, you're absolutely right. And I was thinking, why is that? Why does he not really write at all about the illustrators? And the closest thing I can come to an answer is because they are off-site.
Right. Yeah, they're in a different, yeah.
They're not in the print shop, you know. They're sending their stuff to the engraver, and the engraver is in the print shop or just adjoining it. His brother, by the way, is an engraver, George Dorrington, and I would love to find out more about him and his work. But yeah, that's right. He is curiously oblivious. I can't think of a single. He mentions John Leach because he met him, but otherwise I can't think of a single illustrator besides Prouse, whom he mentions just kind of accidentally, that he writes about. He doesn't do any obituaries, I don't think, of any of them. But yeah, it's a curious blindness on his part.
Yeah. Thanks.
Patrick, you mentioned the thing about, I guess, what we might call upstairs, downstairs, the way in which obviously there's a hierarchy in the print world. Funny enough, I'm editing of some work at the moment which looks at contemporary articles on this particular question, and they do mention that very clearly when they describe, say, a print work like Klaus and Sons printing works, which were in London, were the biggest steam press operators at the time, churning out stuff for everybody and anybody. There's a difference between those who are stumbling along, working in the bowels of the world, creating that text, and the upstairs place, which is the counting house where you get paid, and the editorial rooms where the information is collated and plans are made and decisions are made about what you're publishing and when. And that's it. And the description of it is very much along the lines of what you're talking about, where down below it's all busy, loud, and noisy and cramped. And upstairs they have lovely rooms which have great views and, wainscoted library holdings with lots of leather-bound books behind them. And they have images. So there's one of the Strand magazine where they have, Noon looking rather pensive as he thinks about yet another fabulous issue to launch on the unsuspecting world. And below him, hive activity. It seems to me that's a very interesting dynamic, isn't it, about class structure and how even the workplace is structured in the 19th century along these lines which are industrial.
It really is. I mean, you look at a figure like Mark Lemon, who is who he comes to this from running a pub. So he does not have a lot of social pretensions, and yet within the world of the press, he's a big deal. He is inhabiting this rarefied editorial office, So it's interesting to me in terms of Punch, for example, and some other magazines where it's described when somebody of a higher social class comes to, one of the creatives comes to where the printing is happening. And it's like they're descending to where the printers are. But of course, the printers are actually up above because they're in the rooms that need the sunlight, right? But they're, it's so you get, it's very interesting. Does Dickens? I don't know that Dickens ever comes to the press room. But it's always exciting when somebody comes, and like Douglas Jerrold, who had started out as a compositor, the printers love the fact that he will come and actually grab a composing stick and start setting up his own work in type. It does seem to me that there's a change. Now, David, you would know much better than I would, and I'd like your instruction on this, that as the century wears on, it actually becomes more rather than less stratified, and that you have less of this easy moving among different roles within the printing business that Dorrington had when he was in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. What do you think?
Well, I think you're probably right. There's also the idea of the professionalization, the increasing professionalization of journalism. And Andrew Hobbs has written about that, where you have institutions or institutes being set up precisely to educate or teach people how to be a journalist. You have the whole processes of typing and the way in which linotype and monotype shapes the new trajectory of compositing. You no longer have to sit there sticking, little bits of type into a stick. It's now all done kind of manually, which then allows women into the entry. So there starts new dynamics being put into place. And you're probably right. I think there's the fact that you have that professionalization then starting to shape where people sit. So you don't have the all-rounder, you're now a specialist. Editors clearly used to come from below, from the compositor side, but I think towards the end of the century, I think you're right, it becomes less fluid. And that's what I found so interesting when I was working on that, the book that you kindly mentioned, was precisely that, period from 1830 to 1890, where there was that fluidity, but no one seems to have noticed or mentioned or described or discussed it in ways that suggest that that people could, like Douglas Jerrold and Dorrington, could rise from lower areas of laboring classes to become proprietors and owners and individuals with intellectual aspirations, which I think is quite fascinating. But there's a big project on this at the moment, as you probably know. That's coming out of I think it's Sterling now.
Kirsty
Blair, and the looking at the poetics of working classes, laboring classes, and those journals that are producing material from spinners and foundry people and cotton weavers, and that whole process by which the creative activities of laboring classes have a niche and a space, and you have editors and writers coming out of places that you wouldn't have expected in journals that no one really has paid attention to. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah, that's great.
Anyway, I'll stop
we're
talking.
going to learn more about that at a soon to come RSVP conference, I imagine.
Yes.
When we're in Sterling with Kirsty, we definitely will.
All right, guys. Well, it is sunny and 75 degrees here, and we've been enduring cold rain for weeks. So I'm going to go ride my e-bike.
Thanks so much, Patrick. It's brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah.
It was great to see you all. Thanks for putting this all together, guys. You're terrific.
That's
Thank you
wonderful,
so much.
Patrick.
Cheers
Thank
for
you.
Kari, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Thank
Kruti.
you, Kari, too.
Yeah, you're
Absolutely.
welcome.
Oh, Kari is essential to the whole process.
Yeah.
Stop.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.